Happy December. Happy almost 2024. Welcome back. Let's chat. First of all, I am still getting over what I'm referring to as the bubonic plague. I don't know if it was COVID or flu that became COVID. I don't think it was COVID. It didn't last very long, but the getting over it has lasted forever. So I apologize in advance. There might be some jump cuts from me cutting out places where I'm hacking up one or both of my lungs. Thanks for putting up with me through all this. I'm also probably going to be heavy breathing because I just don't have a lot of space in there to hold a lot of air. So, all right, y'all. So last year I was inspired by the book flood. You can watch the video, it'll be a card, I don't know, somewhere. And so I put my own kind of twist on that tradition, and I went down to a local bookstore and I just picked up a random book and read it over Christmas Eve, and then I made a video about it. And I thought this year I would do the same thing. So I did, except I didn't go on Christmas Eve. I went a couple days before because I just wasn't sure if the bookstore was going to be open, and I could have checked, but I didn't. So I went a couple days before and picked up the book, but I didn't start reading it until Christmas Eve. But I followed the same thing, right? My rules are don't go in with any plan of what to get. Keep it a fiction book and keep it a reasonable length so that I can feasibly complete it in 24 hours. And so that's what I did. I went to the same bookstore, Firehouse Books, in downtown Fort Collins. I love it there. If you've not been there, go. It's so cute. I love it. And I just looked at a couple of different book covers. There were actually several that I was like, maybe that. And I had like a small list of books that I was like, I'll come back to that if nothing else really stands out. And then the one that stood out was the eventual one that I picked up and brought home. And so that's what we're going to talk about. And it was this one, Ghost Eaters, Clay McLeod Chapman. He liked my reel on Instagram, by the way. Thanks for that, Clay. Appreciate it. But this was the sort of winning book. This was the one that caught my attention based on like the little... What did I read? Wait a minute. Oh, this had to be this part. There's nothing on the back jacket. What did I read for the for the synopsis? But that's it. It's this part right here. It's right on the inside. I'm like, I know I read something. So anyway, this was the book that I picked up. So again, I'm not going to give a book review, but I am going to talk about this experience a little bit differently than the way I talked about last year's experience, kind of, but also kind of the same. So last year, I talked about the ways in which I believe that things show up for us when we need them to, right? I'm a firm believer that the universe is always speaking to us, right? That we're always presented with messages that we need, but we aren't always listening or paying attention or seeing them. And this is just another example. It's why I choose my books the way I do. Kind of let the book find me or call to me, and then I pick it up because that fits into this idea or this paradigm I have that like I'm gonna read something I need to read in this moment. Okay, so that was true for this as well, but I want to talk about this from a couple of different perspectives. Again, not doing a book review. I gave it a 4-star rating on Goodreads. I don't put reviews there either. I generally don't review books. It's a thing. I can't explain it. I just don't do it. But I did give it a 4-star rating on Goodreads. So that's the extent of like that part of the review. But I want to talk about this in the ways that I read it, or the experience of reading it and what it meant to me, and some of the reviews that I saw after I read it. I didn't look at anything beforehand. I went in totally blind, or with only this little, internal piece to guide me. And I'm glad I did that, by the way. But then I came back and looked at stuff afterwards, which I'll talk about. So this is going to be maybe in parts, and this video might be a little longer than expected or usual. I hope you'll bear with me. I think that it's kind of important what I have to say, especially if you are a consumer or a writer. So let's jump into the experience of Ghost Eaters. Like I said, I gave it a 4-star rating on Goodreads because I think it's a good read. Now, as a consumer, I am somebody whose background includes addiction, abuse, and I literally just wrapped my clinical internship for as a clinical mental health professional. So, my lens as a consumer is already skewed. It's already skewed a certain way. Whether I want to read things with that lens or not doesn't even matter. It's already tilted in that direction. So, to read a book, right, about addiction and grief and abusive relationships, more than one, is going to hit differently with the lens in which I'm reading it than somebody who doesn't have that experience and or can't begin to fathom or conceptualize what those experiences are like because the only exposure they've had has been through media. All right, so from my lens, I thought that this was well done. Are there places where it's flawed? Are there places where it's maybe over-exaggerated? Sure, I think that's typical in writing or creating, whether you're watching TV or a movie or you're reading a book or any form of artwork. I think that we have a tendency to exaggerate some of the things, the symptoms, if you will, because it's a way of trying to get a consumer or an outsider to kind of be able to conceptualize what's happening internally and make the connections to the things that are happening externally that would impact that internal experience. So, do I think some of that exists in here? Yes, I'm not mad at it. It's fine. It is what it is. But I think the way in which the dynamics of addiction and abuse were captured was really well done. And I'm saying that as a clinician. Because I think, for me, I lost track of the fact that this is technically like a supernatural horror book. It didn't read that way for me, because what I read instead was hallucinatory responses to drugs and a lot of guilt and shame and grief. So I lost track of the fact that this is a horror, like this fits in the horror genre, and it's technically supernatural because ghosts. I forgot that that's the through line here. Instead, I just felt like I was dealing with someone who's having hallucinations that make perfect sense in the context of what's happening in the main character's world and the internal things that she's going through and has been going through for a long time. Because the very little bit that we get of her parents is just enough to recognize this is chronic. It's chronic. You've been in an abusive relationship with your parents. It makes sense you would choose abuse as an adult. Not choose it outright. Not like I want to be in it, but that would be what's comfortable and that would be where the struggle is, because that's what you experienced as a child too. Emotional abuse and neglect is going to transfer to the same sort of dynamics in adulthood. So that made sense to me. And the same thing with addiction. For those who aren't aware, I'm not going to get deep into the education of this, but the term codependency especially as we use it in the clinical setting, actually comes from the observations of the dynamics that existed in families where addiction was present. They were mirrored in relationships that didn't have substance addiction, but there were these codependent patterns. In other words, this addiction to something happening in that relationship that were matched. So the term of codependency comes from addiction and substance, the dynamics in families where addiction and substance use occurs. So it makes, to me, perfect sense that they would mirror each other, and that I would see that play out so much in the main character. Having said all that, I'm getting to a point. So I think that was well done. Is it flawless? Is it perfect? No, I don't think anybody's able to do that, if I'm being really frank, because it's a really hard thing to do. I want to now take that piece and talk about the experience as a writer, because that's me as a reader. As a writer, what stood out for me is that very dynamic, and this became very present when I started looking at reviews, but that'll be the last thing I come to. But that dynamic is what I've been sitting with and in fear of as I've been working on the story for Grace. I had a really hard time during NaNoWriMo. I could not seem to settle into a groove writing her. And I talked a lot about feeling afraid of the reception of her, like after it's written, after the book is done. And I apparently last year also posted something on Instagram that was very similar, because I had this moment while I was in Seattle writing and able to write, where I had this feeling of dread that people were going to not like Grace. And in fact, in my post, I said something about her being an unlikable character. So I've had my finger on the pulse of the challenge for me this whole time, which has been, how do I depict this character and her mental health in a way where people will have compassion for her as opposed to seeing her as a problem? And it dawned on me that I can't, because I think the only people who will see her as a human coping with chronic issues that have led her to behave in these certain ways, the only people who will see her as human are the ones who have an understanding of that pattern and dynamic. Anybody else is going to see her as problematic, as unlikable, as obnoxious, as a bitch. I can't do anything about that. All I can do is stay true to my vision of her, try not to over-exaggerate her experience, which I don't think I've done so far, but I'll need to kind of check it, and at the same time not over-exaggerate the experience of the people involved with her, right? Like the supporting characters, because that foiling can be equally as problematic, right? So keeping that in check for me is going to be really important, because at the end of the day, the book I'm writing is a book about mental health and coping with that in the ways in which our relationships are impaired when we don't get those things in check. So I think, again, divine timing of things showing up when you need them to, this was a really great read for me to see ways in which it can be done well, knowing outright that with a different lens, I might have viewed the main character as a problem. I might have viewed the entire plot line as a problem. I might not have liked the book, because a lot of the reviews that I looked at didn't like the book. And they didn't like it because of the main character. So here's the last piece. And don't want to get too political, but mental health is a political issue. So we're going to go there for just a minute. Please stick with me, okay? A lot of what I saw as a critique, particularly with the main character, is that she is unlikable, she is obnoxious, she is weak. There was a creator on YouTube who struggled with the character being written as more progressive, but unable to make better decisions about her relationships and drug usage, and looked at it from this, what she thinks is a feminist perspective, the creator. And it dawned on me, like, all these pieces play a role, and my character is also a woman. My protagonist is also a woman, having a mental health issue, who, in my story, in my plotline, the main other characters in this woman's life are men, which means that it's a man who mirrors to her the issue that she needs to work on. So outwardly, that's going to look like a man had to tell her that something needed attention, that she was not okay. And I said way back when I first started writing, I feel like there are going to be women who are going to have a problem with this, because it's not going to seem like this main character is rescuing herself, but that she needs a man to do it for her. Today, in the shadow of reading this and looking at reviews, I realize that is part of the systemic problem and how we view women in our society and how we choose to talk about them. And even in my Instagram post a year ago, for me to call my character unlikable means that I'm guilty of the same bias, misogyny, aggressive thoughts, behaviors toward this character, which is actually anti-feminist. Right? Like, we can't claim to be of feminist mind and then call women problematic when they do things that society says doesn't match up. So critiques of this main character, Erin, particularly from that person who was talking about feminism, was that it doesn't make sense. She wouldn't be this progressive female who's also in a problematic relationship and using drugs. That must be a man who doesn't know how to write about a woman. I say, that sounds to me like someone who doesn't understand the complexity of human nature, and that women can be multifaceted, and that can coexist. That someone could be progressive and be caught up in a trauma bond, or be caught up in maladaptive coping skills for their chronic mental health issues. It doesn't mean that she's weak, and it doesn't mean that she's not a feminist. And it doesn't mean that a man doesn't know how to write about her or write a woman. I'm not here to talk about whether or not Clay McLeod Chapman wrote a woman appropriately. It's the critique of her that I'm struggling with, because it's the same critique that I, 2 years ago, was afraid would show up with my character in a book I hadn't even really started writing yet. I had only outlined. That tells me that I'm very aware of the paradigm and the discourse that we have, and that still exists no matter how feminist you think you are. But also that potentially you've got the wrong idea of feminism. You're falling into a wave of feminism that is very polarizing, dichotomizing. But that's not human nature. We are complex creatures, us humans. Multiple things can be true at the same time that otherwise seem mutually exclusive. Totally possible. Totally possible. It also tells me, with those critiques, of which there were several, that these are people who don't understand the dynamics or complexity of abusive relationships and trauma bonding and or addiction, or the ways in which those two things are actually so similar. They have the same addictive effect. I can't expect everybody to know clinically what's happening when they see those things. I don't expect it. I expect, as a society, for us to move in a place where we start to recognize that this is true and we stop picking apart the ways in which somebody is flawed when they fall into these spaces. Because we're still then viewing people as problems as opposed to viewing people as having problems. We're still viewing addiction as a problem. We're still viewing abusive relationships, the people in them, as problematic. What's wrong with you, sis? Why can't you leave? You don't understand the dynamic. That's very clear. What's wrong with you? Why can't you just quit crack? You don't understand the dynamic. That's very clear. All of that is to say, I would like us to reach a point when we, as a broad society of people, begin to see others with compassion. As human beings, complex creatures, who, yes, maybe behave inappropriately because of some shit that has happened to them. We aren't going to deny that they need some help in coping so that they don't cause harm to themselves or other people. But they are not the problem. It's the things that happen to them that are the problem, and their inability to cope that creates these problematic behaviors. They are still not the problem. I hope that that's landing somewhere. Whether you are wanting to argue with it or accept it or take more time with it, whatever, I hope that's landing somewhere. And I had no idea that at the end of reading my chosen fiction book this Christmas that I would land in this place. I'm glad that I have. But I think it's an important consideration as we continue as both consumers, which most all of us are, and then some of us as the creator. How are we going to navigate this space and the discourse in this space and the presentation of mental health in this space so that we can shift the conversation and shift the perception and the paradigm? Because compassion is what is needed when we're talking about mental health, and addiction falls into that, by the way. Compassion is what is needed, not critique. All right, y'all. Thank you for hanging with me this long. I so appreciate it. I hope that you had a wonderful holiday if you celebrate Christmas, Hanukkah, Kwanzaa. I'm not even sure what other winter holidays exist. I hope whatever you were doing was filled with love. And I'll see you in 2024.